So yes, today is the last class, and it's been great to talk about things. And up until today, we've been talking about sort of, for lack of a better term, kind of standard repertoire of what people usually refer to as classical music. I know we talked about that term classical about 6 classes ago, and how it has a variety of meanings, but usually people mean kind of art music is what they mean by it. And until today, everything we've been talking about was um, was composed on another continent. Um, Everything we've talked about today so far is up until today was composed in Europe. Um, it was composed in most cases a long time ago, kind of like the beginning of Star Wars, which says a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. That's often how that a lot of classical music is for us because we live in America. We in the year 2020. So, but of course, the thing is that music, for example, by Beethoven, we still listen to it because it still speaks to us so many centuries later. And it speaks to us in spite of the fact that he, in terms of his verbal language, spoke German, which for most of us is not our native language. Um, but, because it's a kind of a universal language and he's perhaps dealing with universal, eternal kind of truths and aesthetics, it still matters to us. Nevertheless, I want to emphasize in today's class that there is music being written in our own country, first of all. So we're going to talk about a number of American composers in the country that we live in now. And also that there's been music, very much important and interesting music being written in the last 50 or 75 years. So those are the two focal points of today. And some of that is overlapping. In fact, the first half of today, really, I'm going to be focusing entirely on composers from the United States. Now, I mentioned last week that a number of composers, first of all, were influenced by American music, for example, Debussy, and others, whether they wanted to move or didn't want to move, they ended up in the United States. So, for example, Stravinsky, Bartók, Schoenberg, and Rachmaninoff were all composers who, in particular because of unrest and war going on in countries where they lived, they basically escaped to the United States. They weren't all necessarily happy to be here, but they did come, and they were, of course, important figures in music. But one thing about the United States that is perhaps especially different from most European countries, and certainly countries in Asia like China or Japan, is that our history is a lot shorter at this point. It's been a few hundred years of history as opposed to thousands of years in China, or close to that amount in a place like Italy or Central Europe. A lot of countries where their culture goes back further, and so I think a lot of American composers are more predisposed to. They're less connected to tradition, and perhaps for that reason more easily able to experiment and innovate and just say, I'm going to try something totally new, and not be so bound to tradition. So what I want to do, just for a little bit of context, is to hear a piece of music written by a fantastic composer who was living in America when he wrote it, but he wasn't from America, which is Rachmaninoff. Just a little bit of the Corelli variations. This is the one and only solo piano piece that he wrote after moving to the United States. He moved in 1917 or 1918 after the Russian Revolution. And about 12, 13 years later, he finally wrote his one and only solo piano piece after moving here. A lot of the reason that he was not so productive was because of what throughout his whole life he suffered from depression. But I think that was made more acute by being essentially homesick, not particularly happy to be in the United States. But also on a more practical level, he was very busy needing to earn a living as a performer. And so he was on trains and buses and wherever, going from place to place, traveling, practicing. He had less time and energy to compose. But what I want to do is listen to this piece for just a moment, first of all, because it's beautiful, but we're only going to hear about a minute of it. But also to give us a little context. This piece written in 1931. Afterwards, we're going to hear a piece written about 6 years earlier, but you will not guess that piece, the earlier piece, is going to sound a lot more adventurous. But let's just give ourselves a little context here. Some Rachmaninoff. This is a pianist. Let me see. Now, by the way, first time to share something. Let's hope that this goes well. I know we sometimes have issues with this. Okay, I feel very guilty stopping, as I always do, because it's such a beautiful piece. You can listen to the rest of it later. But there's a certain nostalgia in a way in 1931, looking back, first of all, on a composer who lived in the Baroque era, and then writing variations on that in a very romantic style. As I mentioned last week, I think Rachmaninoff was not especially, it wasn't important for him to do stuff that was obviously new and different. Now, in a moment, we're going to hear a piece written a few years earlier by an American composer named Henry Cowell, who was born in California. And a number of the kind of the most experimental people seem to have been from the West Coast, by the way, where within the United States, if there are places that are more traditional and less traditional, I would say the West Coast is even less traditional than the East Coast, which is in turn less attached to tradition than would be in a place like Europe. So I'm going to play in a moment a bit of a piece by Henry Cowell, which is called The Banshee. And a banshee, by the way, is apparently a kind of an Irish mythological spirit who would hang around in graveyards and things like that. So you can imagine that it's a kind of a scary figure. And this piece, what Henry Cowell did, in addition to thinking about like how could he write music in a way that was different than the way that Rachmaninoff wrote it, or the way that Brahms wrote it, or the way that Mozart or Bach wrote it, but in fact even thought about how can I approach the piano as an instrument in a way that's different. Do I have to do it the same way? And so I think you'll see right away when I show you this video that Henry Cowell had a very different idea in this particular piece. He didn't do this in every piece, about which part of the piano you're going to use to make sound with. So let's have a look, and I think you will agree that this is a very scary sounding piece, as the title suggests it should be. Okay, so I think that was perhaps the best way to convey that kind of the terror of an Irish graveyard in the middle of the night. Now, by the way, of course, the filming and the woman's costume and the nails and all that kind of thing was sort of added. None of that was required by Henry Cowell, but he was really experimenting with that. How am I supposed to write music that sounds like that? And why can't I do it a different way? So this kind of tradition of, or I should call it a tradition, the tradition of being anti-tradition in a certain way is perhaps part of the one thread in the American kind of psyche, I think, of just saying, just doing stuff that's different, sometimes maybe for its own sake. But in that case, I think because he really wanted to convey something different. Now, by the way, not every piece he wrote was like that. In fact, that's the only one. But he was always experimenting and trying how to write things in a different way. And again, just to remind you, that was in 1925, some 6 years before Rachmaninoff wrote those Corelli variations. Another experimenter who is perhaps more well known as a name among composers, also born in California, by the way, was John Cage. John Cage's most famous piece, I'm pretty sure, is called 4 minutes and 33 seconds, which some of you are familiar with. I'm sure it's 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. And in order to perform the piece accurately, I've performed the piece, by the way. I was the conductor in that particular performance. There were a number of musicians on stage. You have to have a watch, or in my case, I used my phone to sort of make sure that I was following the directions and it being the right length of time. You can think what you want about that piece, but that is his most famous piece of music. The question is, what exactly is music? When in that case, it's meant to be silence. I have to tell you that that performance that I was involved in, and others, if you go on YouTube, by the way, you can find dozens, if not hundreds of performances of that piece that people have recorded for some reason or other. The tension in the concert hall is amazing because silence is quite powerful. It's a quite powerful musical tool, although usually silence lasts rather more briefly than that. Another John Cage piece, which is not a piano piece, but I'm just going to mention it as sort of to give you some idea of like the things that were on his mind, is he wrote a piece for, I believe it was 12 radios. It might be for 6 radios, but honestly, it doesn't really make a lot of difference how many. You need to have the kind of old-fashioned radio where you turn the dial to go from station to station. And what it is the performers stand on stage, and at various times, as indicated in the score, they will turn the dial on their radio, and you'll hear whatever comes out of their radio, and you'll hear whatever comes out of someone else's radio at that same time. Now, the thing is that, of course, you have no idea what's going to be on the radio in your particular performance. And even the turning the dial, it's like you're going to end up like might be in between stations. It might be full of static. The question is, what exactly is the composer doing? What role does the composer have? Because every performance is different. It's being very, very loosely defined by the composer. So again, I don't know exactly how to say whether that's music or whether that's what a composer's job is or not. I don't know. But what I will do is I'll let you hear a little bit of piano music by John Cage. And one of the things that he innovated in particular was the use of what people refer to as prepared piano. And what that means, I'll try to describe it as best I can, is that John Cage has very specific instructions about things that you need to put inside the instrument. So, for example, he has instructions. You take this size screw, you have to go to this hardware store and say a screw of this diameter, and you put it between these strings at this distance from the hammers, and this kind of screw at this distance from those strings, and this kind of rubber eraser in this place in this location. He has very specific instructions about it. And then when you play the piano, of course, it has an entirely different sound from what you would expect the piano normally to sound like. Now, before we hear an example of this piece that he wrote, I want to play a little bit of music from some Indonesian music, gamelan, which I mentioned briefly last week when we were talking about Debussy, who was definitely influenced by the gamelan. When you hear this, first of all, it's just helpful to hear this music that fascinated a lot of composers, a lot of people. We're going to hear it before we hear the John Cage, and you'll hear that what John Cage really is doing in this prepared piano piece is finding a way to recreate that sound at the piano. So let's first hear some of this Indonesian music. We'll just hear a few moments of it again. Okay, I'm not sure why it suddenly stopped there, but that just gives me a convenient reason to stop. You get the idea. Now, by the way, the men who are sitting in the front, they do eventually get involved, and they're not just sitting there the whole time. But it goes on for quite a while. I have been once in my life to a gamelan concert, and it was hours and hours of what to me sounded all the same. It was interesting for a while, but I don't know quite how to listen to it yet. But you hear this has a very different kind of sound. First of all, the kind of instruments, they have a particular sound, a certain atmosphere. Okay, so let's hear John Cage's, this is from a larger piece called Sonatas and Interludes. Again, this is for prepared piano. The pianist is playing on the keys. And unfortunately, it's not a video where you can see the pianist playing, but because of the things that are inside the piano that have been put in there, the sound is completely different from what you would normally expect playing on the keys of the piano. Okay, good. Did I stop the sharing? Yeah, so I'm sure that you noticed the resemblance between those two kinds of music. Um, Again, the timbre of the music, the sound, but also, you know, I mentioned a moment ago. I mean, I wasn't just being facetious by saying like sometimes when I went to a gamelan concert, I just thought I don't know where this is going, um, and sometimes the atmosphere of that music is it just seems to be there. It doesn't get more dramatic. It just is there, and some of that feeling with the sort of pauses and then it does something else and then it pauses and does something else. Even John Cage picked up on that as well. And so a lot of composers in the West were influenced again by gamelan music. But in that case, John Cage was saying, how can I innovate even the way that the piano is played? I have to tell you that a long time ago when I was in high school, I was supposed to give a performance of those pieces, some of them. And it was canceled at the last moment because the piano tuner was freaking out saying, no way you're going to stick screws and erasers and other things inside the piano. So that was the end of that. And so, but I remember as I was practicing it at home, I played something, it sounds like normal piano music. I knew that I was going to have no concept of what the music would actually sound like until I sat at the piano that had been prepared with all those things. Unfortunately, I didn't get that experience, so maybe one day. But we have to find a piano tuner, or you have to find a piano that's a piece of junk and nobody really cares that you stick those things in there. I'm not sure if it really damages it, but you certainly have to be careful. And understandably, a lot of people would be reluctant to do that to their piano. Okay, now, by the way, not every American composer has been sort of super experimental in the way that Henry Cowell was, in the way that John Cage was. Later on in today's class, at the end of today's class, I'm going to be playing a piece by a composer named George Crumb, who is, in my view, one of the most important living composers. He's alive for now. He's quite old and he's apparently not so well, but he does live in Pennsylvania. And we'll see how many more years he has in front of him. But anyway, that piece is also very, how do I say, pushes the boundaries of how to use the piano. You'll find out about that later. But many other important composers in America, not all of them were like that. And so what I want to do is show you a list, as I have done in previous weeks, of some important American composers and their number one most important piece, according to my very subjective reasoning. So you don't have to take it 100% seriously, but I just want to share it with you anyway. Let me see if I can do that. Here we go. Oh, that's the wrong one. Okay. Okay, just a question because I want to make sure I'm doing this right. Do you see a sheet that says some important Americans, or does it? Great, okay, so I did that right. Okay, so among some of these important American composers are the first two are the ones that we listened to something by them. Henry Cowell, the Banshee is one of his most interesting pieces. John Cage wrote those sonatas and interludes. That was just a very brief excerpt of what is a pretty extensive piece of music. Um, Later on, I'm going to play a piece by George Crumb, which is from an incredible set of pieces called Macrocosmos. There are actually two books that are for solo piano, and each one of them takes about 35 to 40 minutes on its own. Really fascinating music, which I'll talk about in a little more detail later in the class. A composer who is not even remotely innovative in the same way as those composers, although still a great composer, was Samuel Barber. Um, if I had to pick what is the most important piano piece by him, it's probably the Piano Sonata. Barber, in many ways, reminds me of Prokofiev. It's a kind of a post-romantic approach to music. He's in some ways very traditional. He just has somewhat a little bit different approach to harmony than, for example, Brahms. But otherwise, is pretty similar in some ways with and the kind of the structure of the music. It sounds familiar just with slightly his own personality and his own sound. The Barber Sonata was a real specialty of Vladimir Horowitz, by the way, who I know we talked about a little bit last week. When we talk about American composers, there's no way that, oh, wait a minute. Oh yeah, I'm sorry, I was looking at the wrong thing. There's no way we cannot mention George Gershwin. First of all, Gershwin is an important composer and he was a great musician. You might also notice that unfortunately he had a very short life. The pieces of music that he wrote for the piano, of course, Gershwin was primarily a jazz musician. And normally jazz is something that is only written down up to a certain point. You'll have the melody, you'll have the harmonies, and then you, the performer, do to some degree your own thing with that. And the reason that Gershwin can really be put into this category of all these other composers is that he did us the favor, us being classical musicians and audiences, of writing exactly what he wanted us to play. In the case, for example, of Rhapsody in Blue, it doesn't invite improvisation, although you can, but normally jazz would include an improvisational element. But Rhapsody in Blue is perhaps his most well-known, and it does give me a chance to play something that sounds like jazz, even if one of the important features of jazz is your own creativity. And so anyway, so of course he's a very important figure in American music. And by the way, he was a very humble man. After having written Rhapsody in Blue and made a very big success of that, he went to Paris. And there's two different stories, and they might both be true, but that he went there with the intention of studying either with Stravinsky and or with Ravel. Those might both be true. But the story of when he met Ravel is that he said, "I'd really like to study with you." And that Ravel said to Gershwin, he says, "Oh, I love your music. I want to study with you." And definitely Ravel and other composers were very influenced by jazz, the sound of jazz. And so Gershwin was somebody very interesting to them, of course. And especially somebody who had one foot in the classical door because he was writing things down for us to play. Aaron Copland, the next composer I've listed there, is in some ways best described as a kind of a American version of Bartók, in that he was very interested in music from sort of American folk music and how he could incorporate that in his more kind of concert music. For example, maybe one of his best known pieces is the ballet Appalachian Spring. And in that, the most famous melody from Appalachian Spring is not one that he wrote himself. It's a shaker hymn, right? It's right. So a gift to be simple. And so he includes that in there. And there's a lot of other pieces where he does that. He wanted to elevate American folk music to the concert stage in some way, shape, or form. And so that was one of his main approaches and his main contribution in a way to American music. The piece that I've listed there, the Piano Variations, is not at all in that style, I have to tell you. It's almost certainly the most important piano piece he wrote, but it's in a much more dissonant and angular style. It's sort of an earlier phase before he figured out that what he really wanted to do was take folk music and stick it in classical repertoire. Elliott Carter is an interesting composer, and you might notice if you look at his dates, you might realize that he lived to be rather old. 104 is how long he lived to be, 104 years old, and he was busy writing music until pretty much the end. And I have to tell you that in 2008, when he was 100 years old, a wonderful pianist named Ursula Oppens, who plays a lot of contemporary music, had a concert recital tour throughout the US where she was playing the complete piano music of Elliott Carter. That was the recital program that she did that whole year as a kind of 100th birthday celebration. And she came and played it in Boston, and I was in the audience. And at the end of the program, she said, everybody, I have to play an encore. Whether you want it or not, I have to play an encore. And the reason is because when the program was printed, she put all the piano music that he had written on the program. But then after that, he kept writing more pieces for the piano. So she said, in order for this to be the complete piano music of Carter, I have to play this encore. Otherwise, you're not getting what you paid for according to the concert program. So another important composer I want to mention, Leon Kirchner. I had the privilege of getting to know him. He used to live in Boston. He was a professor at Harvard. There is a recording of the complete piano music of Leon Kirchner. Each piece is played by a different performer, and I'm privileged to be the performer of one of those pieces, not the one that's listed here, though. That piece that's listed there, the Piano Sonata number 1, is played by Leon Fleischer, who we talked about a few weeks ago because he died now about 3 weeks ago. Joan Tower, another important composer who fortunately is still alive and still writing very interesting music. And then John Corigliano. I have to tell you that if there was one piece I really, really wanted you guys to hear, you're not going to hear it in this class, you should listen to that piece, the Etude Fantasy. It is absolutely spectacular. First of all, as a sort of a tour de force for the pianist, but also just such really fascinating and gripping music. Also super, super difficult. I'll mention that. So those are some important composers from the United States, and I hope that you'll take some time to get to know them. I realize we can't introduce everything. And trust me, the weirdest stuff is the stuff we heard already, except for the thing that I'm going to play later, which might be even weirder. I don't know. You'll tell me when I play the thing that I play live. So now, of course, in the last 75 years, which is about where we left things off last week, not every important composer has been American by any means. And I do want to talk about a few important composers, first of all, from Europe, and then from a couple of other continents as well, and make sure that we remember that they are there too, and we ought to get to know their music. In particular, I want to start by mentioning, I would say that if I had to pick one or two of the most important European composers in the last 75 years, at the top of that list, maybe tied for with one other person, is the composer Olivier Messiaen. Messiaen's most famous piece is called the Quartet for the End of Time. It includes piano. I'm not going to talk about it in any detail because it's not a piano solo piece. But the Quartet for the End of Time was a piece that he wrote for musicians and instruments that happened to be on hand when he was imprisoned in a concentration camp during World War II. Although, most of the people who we think of as suffering in World War II from in concentration camps are usually Jewish. But there were other groups that also were sent to concentration camps, including Messiaen, because he was Catholic. He wrote this piece for violin, cello, clarinet, and piano because there was apparently those instruments happened to be in this camp. Apparently the string instruments were missing some of the strings. But that piece, the Quartet for the End of Time, not just because of the circumstances, it's an incredible piece of music. And really, most Messiaen, his music is kind of mystical and otherworldly. It's as if it's not about the time as we understand it on Earth, but in a kind of eternal perspective. And I want to talk about what is really his most important piano piece, which is called, I'm going to try to pronounce this 85% correctly in French, is 20 regards sur l'enfant Jésus, which is the 20, not perspectives, 20, something like that, on the baby Jesus. I have to think about what the word regard. It's like 20 views or something like that. And so it's a monumental piece of music, which, dealing with the subject matter that it does, is again kind of otherworldly. And sometimes the music seems to be not moving at all because we're dealing with a different time perspective entirely. We're going to hear a little excerpt from that, and it's very hard to excerpt Messiaen because normally it takes a lot of patience because the music takes place over a very long period of time. But we're going to hear one of the movements, which is called the First Communion of the Virgin. And you know, I have to say that is a particularly complex concept because in sort of the Catholic point of view, Jesus is both the son of Mary, but he's also a divine figure to her. So she takes communion. It's a little bit, there's something poignant about that because it's the body and blood of her son, in addition to being her God. So anyway, it's a complex theme, but in any case, I think you'll hear the kind of the two things. One is the very slow moving, as if it's sort of conveying a kind of eternal sort of time frame thing. That's going to be particularly in the left hand of this piece. And then in the right hand, you'll hear some things that perhaps might remind you, I hope they do, of bird song. Bird song was something that was very interesting and important to Messiaen, and he would sit out in the forest and try to kind of transcribe exactly what the rhythm was, what the pitches were, and then he would incorporate that in his music. He also wrote a piece called The Catalog of the Birds. But in any case, let's hear a little bit of this Messiaen piece. Let me just see if I can remember how to do that. Okay, so unfortunately that's as much as we have time to listen to, but that figure in the left hand that you hear that's kind of one of the many themes that you hear in that piece, and it's kind of this like repeating figure over and over and over again, as if it's a kind of eternal, unchanging sort of theme. It's not only in this movement, but there are 20 movements in this piece. And then meanwhile, there's perhaps the more worldly, everyday thing like birds going on occasionally in the right hand. Now, the other, what I would think of as the most important composer from the last 50 years or so, is a Hungarian composer named George Ligeti. And among Ligeti's piano pieces, the most significant things he wrote were these, I believe they're 18 etudes. And if we were just thinking about music of God and Jesus and Mary, the next piece is called The Devil's Staircase. So Ligeti, and that's not totally without, Ligeti is definitely the world. Is definitely the world's music. If Messiaen is up in the heavens, Ligeti is right here, and it's extremely virtuosic. I'll let you hear that in a moment. Let me see if I can do that. Okay, I don't know why that happened a couple times today where stuff just sort of suddenly wanted to stop. But to me, it's amazing. I mean, first of all, it's a very, the tension about that piece, and I'm sorry we don't get to hear the whole thing because it just keeps building and building and building. It's as if this like staircase, it just keeps going, which I don't know how that's possible because there are only 88 keys on the piano. So you're going to run out eventually, but it just seems to keep on going up and up and up. By the way, also one of the other etudes by Ligeti has a title. It's called Galam Borong. It sounds like it's Indonesian, although I've talked to friends of mine who are from Indonesia say it's fake Indonesian, but or Bahasa, I think is the name they call the language they speak in Indonesia. But just yet another person who was really taken with that music from that country. So let me share another list here. Uh-oh, where did it go? Oh, now I got to find it. Okay, now. That's the one we looked at before. Here we go. Okay, are you guys seeing something that says Europe at the top of the page? No. Oh, okay. Well, let me try this. This happened before too. Okay, let me try again. All right. Now, does it say Europe? Great. Okay. I didn't do anything differently, but for some reason doing it twice seems to help. Okay, so just among the names and pieces that are worth your getting to know in the future, if you have time for it, I already mentioned Messiaen and Ligeti. Some other important European composers include Luciano Berio, who I got to know briefly. He lived in Boston for a short time, for a few years. Pierre Boulez, who was important not only as a composer, but also very important in championing championing, yeah, I got that. The music of other composers, particularly as a conductor. They performed, he conducted an ensemble called the Ensemble Intercontemporain, which played a lot of new music and a lot of the newest new music, providing a forum for that and really performing it as well as it could be performed. Henri Dutilleux wrote that piano sonata. Out of all the pieces on this list, I would say that's the most easily accessible. There's some parts of it which are quite jazzy, very appealing music. Everybody likes that piece, I'll just tell you. There are other pieces by Dutilleux, not that sonata, which are much more, I don't know, for lack of a better term, I'll just say edgy, but that piece is very, very accessible and friendly to the audience. Gubaidulina is a Russian composer who fortunately is still alive. The chaconne that she wrote is quite a great piece. A chaconne is a kind of a Baroque form of music. The most famous is by Bach. It's for solo violin. But that kind of Baroque form is something she imitated in some ways in that piece. I also want to mention that there's been important music from other continents besides Europe and besides North America. First of all, in South America, among the most important composers are Ginastera. Those pieces that are called Tres Danzas Argentinas are probably the most well-known. He's yet another example of a composer who wanted to take folk music and traditional music from his own country and to share that with the rest of the world in a kind of a more thoroughly composed and art song kind of way. So anyway, so those the three Danzas Argentinas are probably his best known pieces, but there's many other examples which sound like they're from Argentina as he was. And then I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce this. Maybe some of you have better skill in pronouncing Portuguese than I do, but I believe the composer listed there is pronounced Villa-Lobos from Brazil. I usually say Villa-Lobos, but I think that's wrong. I think it's Villa-Lobos. Among the important pieces that he wrote was that piece which it translates as like the child's room or child's playthings or something like that. So it's a bit like there's a Schumann piece called The Scenes from Childhood. This is Villa-Lobos's kind of perspective on that. And for example, one of them is about a doll called it's called Polichinello, which is like, you know, Punch and Judy. And so it's a fun piece. It's very entertaining. But those are two of the most important, I would say, composers from South America. And then finally, the last continent I'm going to mention here as producing some important composers is Asia. First and foremost is Toru Takemitsu, the Japanese composer. A lot of his music also is specifically incorporating traditional Japanese elements. For example, he wrote a lot of orchestral music that would, in addition to what we think of as Western classical instruments like the violin and the cello and the clarinet, would also include Japanese traditional instruments like koto or shakuhachi in the ensemble, and would quote or at least sound similar to Japanese folk music. His piano music is not particularly like that because it's a piano and so it's going to sound like itself. But among the pieces that are worth hearing are this piece called Rain Tree Sketch. And you know, a lot of his music is very spare and very sparse. Sometimes one of the hallmarks I think there's a lot of traditions in Japan, but among them are to try to say the most with the least amount of things. So for example, if you go to a sushi place, sometimes in a fancy sushi restaurant, you have a big plate and there's one piece of fish over here and that's it. You know, that's like this, it's like just a kind of minimalist sort of approach. And Takemitsu's music is a bit like that sometimes. And certainly the piano music is like that, very spare. And finally, we're going to hear a little excerpt in a moment of a piece by Tan Dun. Tan Dun is from China. In addition to writing great, important art music, classical music that we were talking about in this class, he also wrote the soundtrack for at least one film. I think I didn't see it, but called Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. And he wrote I think the theme music for the Beijing Olympics a few years ago. But we're going to hear this in a moment. And one thing that I want to mention is that you know, there are so many great performers now, particularly over the last few decades and accelerating in recent years, who come from China, I mean, from Asia in general, but in particular from China. Among them, Yuja Wang, who we heard briefly last week. In a moment, we're going to listen to Lang Lang playing a little bit of this tandun. And so with so many great performers, I think we're likely to hear more and more important music from important composers as well. That's sort of starting to happen. That we hear in the West, we hear music from there. Now, the reason I particularly want to focus on this piece in a moment, aside from the fact that it's a great piece and you should hear it, is you may recall last week my mentioning how many composers, first and among them Debussy, were influenced by music from Asia. The scales, the sort of the atmosphere, trying to imitate the sounds of different kinds of instruments. So you'll hear some, when you hear this piece in a moment, which I'm going to let you hear, there's some of it that sounds very Chinese because, which it's meant to, perhaps because of the kinds of scales, the kinds of notes that he chooses, the melodies, but also what it might remind you of, because it definitely reminds me of this, it sounds a bit like Debussy, because I think it's kind of in a way come full circle where Tan Dun was like, oh, let me try to, if I'm going to write something that sounds like watercolor, you know who was great with that kind of sound was Debussy. So it's kind of, to me, it's kind of fun that Debussy was imitating music from Asia and now an Asian composer is imitating Debussy. You may or may not have that same perspective, but that's how I look at it anyway. So let's hear a little bit of that. This is a performance by Lang Lang of one of the movements from these 8 memories in watercolor. Okay, so I don't know if you have the same impression I do, but it sounds, yes, like Chinese music because of this, um, which is called pentatonic scale. There's more than one version of pentatonic scale, but that's one of them. And that tends to be more often used in Chinese traditional music, but that's sort of the floating quality and this, and also those harmonies does remind me of Debussy. So he paid his debt back to the continent, if not the country where he gained so much. Debussy did. Okay, so the last thing that I'd like to have you hear today is something I'm going to play live. It takes a little bit of preparation, and let me tell you a little bit about it. So George Crumb wrote these more than one suite of pieces called Macrocosmos, each consisting of 12 movements. They're all supposed to correspond to signs of the zodiac. But in particular, the movement that I want to play for you now is called, let me just make sure I got the right title. I believe it says Ghost Nocturne for the Druids of Stonehenge. And so again, it's sort of atmosphere of mystery and questioning. I don't know how many of you have seen this. I don't know if it's my #1 favorite movie, but it's definitely my top 5 is the movie Spinal Tap. And so that anyway, so that there's a moment where they have a song that the band plays, which is called Stonehenge, and that starts out by them introducing, saying, the Druids, nobody knows who they were or what they were doing. So anyway, this is definitely a very mysterious sounding piece. So in any case, I'm going to play it for you, and it involves a number of what we call extended techniques. In this case, not so extended techniques, meaning making sound other than the usual way by pressing your finger on the key. I do also have to put my fingers on the keys. But one of the things it involves is a couple of drinking glasses, which I'm going to go grab in a minute. Actually, let me just show them to you. They're just glasses I got out of my kitchen. And I'm going to have the camera in such a place that you'll hopefully be able to see what I'm doing with them. They're going to be pressing the keys a little bit and making what we consider to be kind of harmonics in there. And I think a very eerie and strange sound appropriate to conveying the idea of ancient Druids thousands and thousands of years ago. So now this one, I don't have to do the usual thing I do, but I do have to turn on my camera, which is somewhere else. So this is going to take me about 30 seconds to get set up here. Okay, everybody can see inside to where the piano is, yes? Okay, all right, and then let me just point this a little bit so you can kind of see what I'm doing without my computer falling on the ground. All right, you'll be able to see a little bit of what I'm doing here as well. Okay. And any questions, you can ask me about it afterwards. Okay, little different than some of the other pieces we heard in the previous weeks, right? Good. So, and unfortunately, I'm sorry, I'm taking the piece a bit out of context because it's a part of a much larger suite where each piece has different things that it does. Maybe it's glasses in the piano. Sometimes it's other objects in the piano. Sometimes it's just pizzicato. That's all that I was going to say, but I'm happy to answer questions, whether about that piece or anything else that came up today or even in a previous week.
Max, this is Bob. So how do you know what you're playing? How is that written down? Obviously not normal notes.
Well, in a sense it is. So, I mean, I'm going to try my best to show you on the, anyway, what am I showing? Yeah, so there's instructions. You have to play specific notes, and then you have to have, the glass has to be a certain length so that it covers those notes and makes a certain sound. And then inside the piano, I can probably show you with my camera. Hold on just a minute. It's actually my phone. Okay. I don't know if you can see that I have little Post-it notes inside. You can see those that just tell me what note they are because normally I know what note things are, but when I'm looking on the inside of the piano, I can't tell what notes they are. So I have to put little marks in there to tell me, oh, that's an A flat. Oh, that's a G. And so he absolutely does notate all of it precisely. There's a rhythm. Yeah. So it's interesting because you have to learn. There are other pieces by Crumb which involve more of like actually playing on the keys in the sort of the normal way, in addition to doing things inside the piano. That one doesn't have a lot of that. But mostly the kind of challenges are how to like make a different kind of sound on the piano than what you spent your whole life trying to do, making different kinds of sounds, basically. Yeah.
That is not music anymore. It's just, it goes beyond my scope of ever wanting to perform it or even listen to. I turn it off immediately because it sounds like, any kind of industrial noise or whatever. So it goes way beyond of what I want to ever hear.
I see. Okay, well, I'm sorry to hear that. But yeah, that I have to tell you, the first time I heard this piece, it's part of a larger suite. I was totally mesmerized by all the things the kind of the sounds that he could come out of the piano. And maybe that one is for you not the most effective one. It's one of the shorter ones, why I picked it.
But it created an emotional reaction in you.
Mm-hmm.
In me, yes.
Yes, and I think that's the purpose of it.
Turned off with music. I have enough noise in my life that I don't want to hear. So I don't want to hear the music. I just rather hear something that's pleasing to my ear and that kind of soothes my soul. So my other question was, why are there not any more female musicians? And already I see that there are some lists. I put that on the chat of female composers too. But isn't it that female composers were really not heard until this century, really?
Right. Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah, so today, I believe, was the first time I even mentioned some important composers who were women. I mean, among them, I mentioned Gubaidulina, who's Russian, and Joan Tower, who's American. There are a number of other important women composers, but especially, I didn't really start to talk too much about some of the sort of a little bit of a younger generation. There's a lot of important and successful women composers who are, for example, in their 30s, 40s, 50s now. Yeah. And so, for example, just to name a few, there's a composer named Jennifer Higdon, who's been very, very successful. There's Kajia Saryaho. Oh, hold on just a minute. I'm not sure what happened there. Okay, I think it gave up on my phone. A Finnish composer. Lyra Auerbach, who's Russian, but she lives in America. I mean, there's some fantastically, and it's finally, I would say that there's no real, how do I say this? There are just as many women composers in the sort of current generation who are having success as male composers, which was certainly not the case in earlier generations. But I would say now that it is, and so I know that a lot of that is just social, and that the sort of what was socially acceptable or what was maybe socially possible. You might remember that it was about 5 classes ago, I mentioned something about Clara Schumann.
Yeah.
Clara Schumann was a trailblazer in the sense that she was the first really great and famous female performer. And I'm sure there were other performers who were extremely accomplished, but would only play in private. But she made a career being in public. It just wasn't for women at that point. Now, this is in the year this is in the sort of mid 1800s.
Or Nannerl Mozart.
Right. Well, and it's hard to know. I mean, just to say that maybe she wasn't quite like her brother is not fair. Like nobody was like like Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, but apparently she was certainly great as a child. But probably, yeah, it's very possible that for social or cultural reasons, the opportunity was not given to her to develop or to share. It's hard for me to know, and that's different now. Fortunately, one of my favorite young students, she's graduating from high school. I mostly have college students, but I have a high school student, is a composer. She's been studying piano with me, but her main focus is a composer. She's going to go to the Guildhall School in London in a few days if she can get on the plane and use her American passport. I'm not sure how that's going to happen, but anyway, she apparently has a student visa. But anyway, but that's, and she's one of many. But yeah, it's something that has sort of gradually changed. Yeah, fortunately.
Max, is it possible that some of the works by, say, Mozart or Schumann were actually written by Nannerl or Clara, and just to make it more acceptable?
There's some rumors about that, also about, like, for example, Mendelssohn's sister, Felix Mendelssohn's sister was named Fanny. To be honest, I don't think so, because there are pieces by Clara Schumann and there are pieces by Fanny Mendelssohn. I don't know of any by Nannerl Mozart. And they have some resemblance because they could not have helped but be, influenced by each other living in the same house. But it's not quite in the same category. And, I think it was just not possible for them to focus as much of their time because they were asked to do other things. In the case of Clara Schumann, first of all, she was a great performer and she was busy doing that. Then apparently she had to raise all the kids. I'm not sure what Robert was doing. But so she was busy doing that. And Robert, of course, had a unique talent, which also Clara did. And I've played some pieces by Clara Schumann. They are actually interestingly similar to Robert. Fanny Mendelssohn also sort of similar to her brother Felix, because I feel like it's possible, we talked about this a few weeks ago, that there are some cases, like for example with sculptures. I always heard this about the sculptor Rodin, that sculpture, especially like a big monumental thing like the Burghers of Calais or something like that, there's usually a team. It's kind of the workshop of Rodin that gets involved. And supposedly I don't think they were married, but maybe they were, Camille Claudel, was responsible for some of the like really difficult things like the hands and feet.
Yeah.
Suppose, and it's kind of hard to know for sure, but that's a little more of a collaborative thing where people are all working together. I don't know. There's one of the rumors also there's about Bach, so that one of his wives, he was only married at one at a time, but his second wife after the first one died was named Anna Magdalena, and there's only I think a couple copies of the cello suites that exist, and one of them is in her handwriting, and the other one is in some other friend's handwriting. There's no copy in Bach's handwriting, if that makes sense, J.S. Bach's handwriting. And that's because there was no such thing as a copy that wasn't copied by hand. There were no photocopies in those days. So that's given rise to the theory that Anna Magdalena wrote those pieces. I don't think she did, but I don't know. I guess it's possible. So,
Max?
Yes, Kelvin.
Relating to this session, and forgive me if I come from a biased Brit perspective, but I had these people in my brain as you were doing this.
Yeah.
Ralph Vaughan Williams, Benjamin Britten, Edward Elgar, and even Gustav Holst.
So those are all 4 important composers, and I thought about them.
They didn't make the cut.
Not piano.
They just didn't write very important piano music.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the only reason I have to tell you, because Holst's most famous piece is The Planets, of course. Elgar wrote a lot of great orchestral music. I'm not aware of any piano music. I'm sure that it exists, but I've never heard anyone playing. Benjamin Britten is a great, great, great composer. So many great things: operas, vocal music, symphonic music, chamber music. but just for one reason or another didn't write important piano music. That's the only reason. I was thinking about that, Kelvin, actually, because I was like, oh, I see Kelvin. He's going to wonder why I haven't mentioned an English composer. And by the way, now I'm forgetting his name. There's a young composer. Well, he's relatively young. He's in his 40s or 30s. I'm forgetting his name. Quite interesting from England. And I'm going to try to remember his name just to tell you later, but I'm going to come back to that. Yeah. But yes, sorry about that, Kelvin. But for some reason, they didn't seem to care about the piano so much.
I know you mentioned Gershwin, but not a lot on jazz. So like Scott Joplin and that sort of range of people, are they considered to be great within this realm that you're talking about?
Oh boy, yeah, now it's getting really complicated because you can write great music and the question is how do we categorize it, and do we need to categorize it? I really like the music of Scott Joplin. I'm not sure I think of Scott Joplin in the same category as Schubert, but nobody's in the same category as Schubert. But if, for example, I heard somebody on a piano recital include some Scott Joplin, I wouldn't be surprised. But it's a different kind of music, and that's really like kind of like the precursor to jazz. Jazz becomes like a really different kind of thing. And by the way, I love jazz. And as a side note, one of my friends from college, who is not a musician by profession, he's in finance, which is a much smarter thing to do. But he's a great jazz player. He was very serious about it, but just went into a different profession. So I've been taking jazz lessons with him for the last 2 months. He lives in Tokyo, but now once we realized that, it's like, wait a minute, he went there for his job. He ended up settling down there, but it's like, it doesn't matter, and it's a way for me and one of my college roommates to stay in touch too. So I'm learning a lot about that. But that becomes a really different kind of music. It's a different kind of practice, a different skill set. There are some performers who very effectively bridge those gaps and say, I'm going to play some Bach, and now I'm going to play some, I'm going to take some jazz standards and improvise. Yeah, that does exist, but it's hard to know, like, when does it belong in the same category? And there's a lot of very important, insignificant music from the last 75 years, which definitely does not fit into the category of classical music. I mean, I'm not going to say that the Beatles are not important, or Led Zeppelin, it's like, or Broadway, that's all, like, that's significant stuff too. But it's like, well, I don't know, like, where to draw the line in terms of what I can talk about. And also part is I only have an hour. So, but yeah, it's a good question. I don't know how to answer it in a certain way.
Keith Jarrett might be one of those performers that bridges the gap.
Right. So yeah, so Keith Jarrett, who's a great jazz pianist, obviously. But yeah, he has some wonderful recordings of all the Shostakovich preludes and fugues. I feel like I've heard him play some Handel as well, maybe Bach. I can't remember. And, and it's hard because people say, Keith Jarrett. And then you're like, but it's like, just, he doesn't know what he's doing. But actually, he does know what he's doing. And the same thing happens to classical performers. If they say, I want to play some jazz, you're like, that guy doesn't know what he's doing. There's a tendency to try to pigeonhole people and say they can play this kind and not that kind. But some can do both. This is a different genre, but for example, Leonard Bernstein, who was one of the most important conductors of the 20th century, an incredible musician and interpreter of, Mozart, Beethoven, Mahler, Shostakovich, and also, wrote maybe the, one of the great Broadway musicals, West Side Story. West Side Story. So
yeah, Candide.
Yeah, right. And so, right. So he wrote also Candide. So it's like, which is kind of, can't decide what kind of genre it is, So yeah, the distinctions become a little artificial, but we got to have some way to organize the record store so we can find what we're looking for. Any other questions, comments? Bob, go ahead.
Max, I asked you this question about a decade ago, but I forgot your answer, and it may have changed. Where are you with composing?
Oh, I'm sure we must have had this conversation before. So when I was growing up, I did have the chance to study composition a little bit. My compositions were okay, but they were student compositions, obviously. Whether or not I would have been a good composer if I kept following it is a question I can't answer, but I just didn't feel the urgency to write music down. Like I didn't walk around thinking I have this thing in my head, I've got to put pen to paper and write it down. You may or may not know there's a famous collection of essays, really, by a German poet named Rainer Maria Rilke called The Letters to a Young Poet. And what happens in that book is that there's a poet who writes to Rilke and he sends him his poetry and he says, "Dear Mr. Rilke, should I be a poet based on the poetry I sent you in this envelope?" And then, of course, you get the annoying answer, and I'm giving you an example of it by doing this myself. Instead of just saying, "Yes, you should be a poet," or "No, you should become a banker," or something, he says, "Well, you need to ask yourself, could you live without writing poetry? And if the answer is you couldn't live without it, then you need to write poetry. But if you can, you should do, it's if there isn't that urgency." So I never felt that way about composing music. I do feel that way about playing it. I have to play. I have to perform. I have to, and so during this whole coronavirus time, I've been like, my piano is, not that you can tell how my house is set up, but it's a kind of a townhouse. It's on the bottom level. And so, I come down here and this is where I sort of, feel at home with instruments. So that's urgent to me, but composing wasn't. Now, one difference is, however, is that now that, like I said, I'm taking these, my jazz lessons with my old college roommate via Zoom in Tokyo. It's an 11-hour time difference from Boston, by the way, so it's a little tricky to find the right time to do it. But yeah, so there is like a creative side, as opposed to like a performer is more of a recreator, but a composer is creating something original. So I have to do a little bit of that, and that's been fun. It's been good to exercise that part of my brain. But like I said, I don't feel the urgency to do it. That's all.
Good answer. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Other comments or questions? It's your last chance.
Okay,
Just
Max.
wanted to say thank you for the wonderful series.
Oh, you're welcome. It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. That was awesome.
Yeah, Max, actually, I've got a comment to make.
Sure.
When I was a kid, and I'd never heard of John Cage, although I subsequently went into very, very avant-garde music, which you were mostly not dealing with today. We did prepared pianos. We had a baby grand and we had a cheap upright. And there was no precursor to our experimenting with sound on the piano. We kids just kind of invented it. And I've always wondered where the prepared piano world came from. Did it come from kids experimenting? I don't have the answer.
I don't know. I mean, I think that one of my thoughts about it, not specifically about prepared piano, but that's just one example of, as I said, it seems to be a big part of the American psyche to just say, let's just do something no one's done before. Sometimes just for the sake of doing something that no one's done before. And then maybe it works. And the sort of less attachment to what cultural traditions, I think that's just part of our tradition, so to speak, is not to have traditions. I mean, I grew up in LA. I've lived in Boston for a long time now. And I have to say that LA, it does have more old traditional buildings than you might think, mostly in the downtown area. But otherwise, if something is old, they just tear it down and build a new one, and that's different than in, you walk around in Italy and you see like some building that the Romans, or the Etruscans were like building. And so it's just that feeling of culture and heritage is different. I have to mention one thing before I forget. I know that there might be others like this, but I've been thinking about Karen Risch is right there. I've been thinking, Karen, you have something in common with John Cage, and maybe you don't want to hear this, or maybe you do. But John Cage was really into like hunting for mushrooms. So that was his big hobby. And so it was this like crazy looking guy who would go through the forest and find mushrooms. So now I have a feeling that Karen is not the only one. In fact, I've witnessed conversations between some of you, like trying very hard not to tell each other where your mushroom spot is. But anyway, I know Colorado's famous, but anyway, I've had some fantastic mushroom dishes that Karen made from mushrooms she found. So anyway, but that you have in common with John Cage, I'll tell you.
The Hill Houses are great mushroomers as well. Sue and Tom Hill House.
Okay. Oh, yes. They're the ones I think I remember witnessing them talking about it. And
yeah, they're very secretive.
Around the topic of the location.
Yes, very secretive.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say one thing about Honorable Mozart. In the 18th century, it was very, very important for the girls to marry well. And she married very, very well. And that was also important in the family because they struggled financially all their lives, as everybody knows. But I just wanted to throw that in. Nana married very well. She moved to the Lake District. She lived in the Lake. I've seen her house.
I see. Okay. Oh, I didn't know that. Okay. Well, so.
She had a pleasant and happy life, unlike her brother who died young.
Yeah. Well, so I wonder if there are then at least some surviving, not direct ancestors, but relatives of Mozart.
I don't remember that part, but she had a lovely spot in on the Zays in the lakes.
I see. Okay. Good for her. I hope Wolfgang was able to visit once in a while.
They needed money. And I remember her family was really glad that she'd married well.
Well, I know it was a thing, you know, so that this is not even, you don't have to go that far back in time, where being able to play the piano or some other instrument was like, for young women, was like a real, like, kind of like a real plus sort of.
Yeah, it was.
That, you know, and especially if you can imagine in the days when there were no radios or, you know, CD players, and that if you wanted to hear music at home, it needed to be played in your home live by somebody. And of course, in theory, you know, young men or old men or whatever kind of men could be doing that as well, but it was a little more traditional, that was like women needed to learn how to do that if they wanted to marry well. And so she must have been really, you know, that maybe that helped.
She was a good catch.
Yeah. Okay, well, good for her.
Max, one last question. Have you ever come across the glass harmonica?
Ah, yes, I have. So do you want to tell people what that is? Because Mozart wrote a piece for it, you know.
Yeah, he did.
We brought a glass harmonica performer, and there's very few of them, to Montrose, probably 25 years ago. I was just amazed. I mean, and what they've got to do to their fingers, you know, to prepare. But it's lots of glasses, and you do this like you could do on a wine glass to make a sound. But he has like 100 of them or whatever it is, and they're all in different. It looks like a keyboard of an organ. They're all different sizes. It makes an amazing noise, though.
Yeah, you know, that's right. So yeah, I mean, the glass harmonica, the name of it doesn't really, because you start thinking about a harmonica that you play with your mouth. It's nothing to do with that. It's just that, yeah, it's just everybody's done this, like, you know, done around the rim of the glass, you know, in the restaurant to annoy the other patrons in the restaurant. But yeah, to like specific pitches. And yeah, Mozart wrote a piece for that. You know, yeah, and it's quite a sound, I can tell you, and it travels. Because when you're in a restaurant and someone, like if my kids are doing it, I'm like, stop it. The people at the next table do not appreciate that you're doing that. So, yeah. Well, in Montrose, and you know, that's in a place where it's so dry, probably at intermission, they have to get more water for the second half of the concert.
Retune the device.
Well, good. Well, so I'm very happy to hear all of your thoughts. And it's been great to be able to connect a little bit. And please stay in touch. If you guys have questions or thoughts or that you want to share, I have to admit that I'm like super busy these days. But especially if you send it to me in the form of an email, and if you don't hear back from me, email me again. And then by the third time, I'll start to feel really guilty and say, oh yeah, I will answer that. But anyway, I'm always happy to hear it from everybody, and whether it's about
what's your email address?
I'll get it from Heather, because it's too complicated. Yeah.
You owe me about 3 then.
I know I do. I'm thinking of you as particular, Bob. You said something about Bernstein and Beethoven. I have to look at it again.
Nobody answers. But I don't feel bad about that. Yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, well, it's great to see you all, and I'm hoping that Hazel and Heather and I will have a little something to tell you in the near future about future plans. We're certainly hoping on next summer and maybe something else. We'll see what happens. So I don't want to give it away.
Right.
Okay.
There you go.
All right. Great to see you all.
Thank you, Max.
All right. Take care.
Thank you. It's great Wednesday.
It's been wonderful.